His nationality was a great puzzle. The English name spoke plain enough for one side of his house, but of what manner of nation was his mother? If she'd been an American, he'd certainly have had high cheekbones and reddish skin. If a German, he should have known the language, and Squire Smith declared he didn't. If French, and his having that frog pond made it seem likely, it would come out in his speech. No, there was nothing he could be but Dutch. And strangest of all, though the man always pricked up his ears when you talked of Holland, he didn't seem to know the first thing about the country when you put him to the point. Anyhow, as no letters ever came to him from his mother's family in Holland, and as nobody living had ever seen old Higgs, the family couldn't be anything much. Probably Thomas Higgs himself was no better than he should be. For all he pretended to carry himself so straight, and for their parts the gossips declared they were not going to trouble their heads about him. Consequently, Thomas Higgs and his affairs were never failing subjects of discussion. Picture, then, the consternation among all the good people when it was announced by somebody who was there and ought to know that the postboy had that very morning handed Higgs a foreign-looking letter, and the man had turned as white as the wall, rushed to his factory, talked a bit with one of the head workmen, and without bidding a creature good-bye, was off, bag and baggage, before you could wink, madam. Mistress Scrubbs, his landlady, was in deep affliction. The dear soul became quite out of breath while speaking of him. To leave lodgings in that sudden way without never so much as a day's warning, which was what every woman who didn't wish to be trodden under foot, which, thank heaven, wasn't her way, had a right to expect, a perfect right to expect. Yes, and a week's warning, now you mention it, and without even so much as saying many thanks to you, Mr. Scrubbs, for all past kindnesses, which was most numerous, though she said it who shouldn't say it. Leastwise, she wasn't never so kind of a person to be looking for thanks never a minute. It was really scandalous, though, to be sure. Mr. Iggs paid up everything to the last farthing. It fairly brought tears to her eyes to see his dear empty boots lying there in the corner of his room, which alone showed trouble of mind, for he always stood 'em up straight as sogglers, though being half sold twice, they hadn't, of course, been worth taking away. Whereupon, as she was talking about this, her dearest friend, Miss Scrubkins, ran home to tell all about it, and, as everybody knew, the Scrubkinses, a shining gossamer of news, was soon woven from one end of the street to the other. An investigating committee met that evening at Mrs. Snigham's, sitting in secret session over her best china. Though invited only to a quiet tea, the amount of judicial business they transacted on that occasion was prodigious. The biscuits were actually cold before the committee had a chance to eat anything. There was so much to talk over, and it was so important that it should be firmly established that each member had always been certain sure that something extraordinary would be happening to that man yet, that it was nearly 8 o'clock before Mrs. Snigham gave anybody a second cup of tea. One snowy day in January, Lorenz Boykman went with his father to pay his respects to the Brinker family. Ralph was resting after the labors of the day. Gretel, having filled and lighted his pipe, was brushing every speck of ash from the hearth. The dame was spinning, and Hans, perched upon a stool by the window, was diligently studying his lessons. It was a peaceful, happy household, whose main excitement during the past week had been the looking forward to the possible visit from Thomas Higgs. As soon as the grand presentation was over, Dame Brinker insisted upon giving her guests some hot tea. It was enough to freeze anyone, she said, to be out in such crazy, blustery weather. While they were talking with her husband, she whispered to Gretel that the young gentleman's eyes and her boy's were certainly as much alike as four beans, to say nothing of a way they both had of looking as if they were stupid and yet knew as much as anybody's grandfather. Gretel was disappointed. She had looked forward to a tragic scene, such as Annie Bowman had often described to her from storybooks. And here was the gentleman who had come so near being a murderer, who for 10 years had been wandering over the face of the earth, who had believed himself deserted and scorned by his father, the very young gentleman who had fled from his country in such magnificent trouble, sitting by the fire just as pleasant and natural as could be. To be sure, his voice had trembled when he talked with her parents, and he had met his father's look with a bright kind of smile that would have suited a dragon killer bringing the waters of perpetual youth to his king, but after all, he wasn't at all like the conquered hero in Annie's book. He did not say, lifting his hand toward heaven, "I hereby swear to be forever faithful to my home, my God, and my country," which would have been only right and proper under the circumstances, all things considered. Gretel was disappointed. Ralph, however, was perfectly satisfied. The message was delivered. Dr. Boykman had his son safe and sound, and the poor lad had done nothing sinful after all, except in thinking his father would have abandoned him for an accident. To be sure, the graceful stripling had become rather a heavy man. Ralph had unconsciously hoped to clasp that same boyish hand again, but all things were changed to Ralph for that matter. So he pushed back every feeling but joy as he saw father and son sitting side by side at his hearthstone. Meantime, Hans was wholly occupied in the thought of Thomas Higgs's happiness in being able to be the meester's assistant again, and Dame Brinker was sighing softly to herself, wishing that the lad's mother were alive to see him, such a fine young gentleman as he was, and wondering how Dr. Boykman could bear to see the silver watch getting so dull. He had worn it ever since Ralph handed it over. That was evident. What had he done with the gold one he used to wear? The light was shining full upon Dr. Boykman's face. How contented he looked! How much younger and brighter than formerly. The hard lines were quite melting away. He was laughing as he said to the father, "Am I not a happy man, Ralph Brinker? My son will sell out his factory this month and open a warehouse in Amsterdam, and I shall have all my spectacle cases for nothing." And started from his reverie. "A warehouse, mynheer? And will Thomas Higgs, is your son not to be your assistant again?" A shade passed over the meester's face, but he brightened with an effort as he replied, "Oh, no. Lorenz has had quite enough of that. He wishes to be a merchant." Hans appeared so surprised and disappointed that his friend asked good-naturedly, "Why so silent, boy? Is it a disgrace to be a merchant?" "Not a disgrace, mynheer," stammered Hans. But what?" "Why, the other calling is so much better," answered Hans, "so much nobler. I think, mynheer," he added, kindling with enthusiasm, "that to be a surgeon, to cure the sick and crippled, to save human life, to be able to do what you have done for my father, is the grandest thing on earth." The doctor was regarding him sternly. Hans felt rebuked. His cheeks were flushed. Hot tears were gathering under his eyelashes. "It is an ugly business, boy, this surgery," said the doctor, frowning at Hans. "It requires great patience, self-denial, and perseverance." "Oh, I'm sure it does," cried Hans, kindling again. "It calls for wisdom, too, and for a reverence for God's work. Ah, mynheer, it may have its trials and drawbacks, but you do not mean what you say. It is great and noble, not ugly. Pardon me, mynheer. It is not for me to speak so boldly." Dr. Boykman was evidently displeased. He turned his back on the boy and conferred aside with Lorenz. Meanwhile, the dame scowled a terrible warning at Hans. These great people, she knew well enough, never liked to hear poor folk speak up so pertly. The meester turned around. How old are you, Hans Brinker?" 15, mynheer," was the startled reply. Would you like to become a physician?" "Yes, mynheer," answered Hans, quivering with excitement. "Would you be willing, with your parents' consent, to devote yourself to study, to go to the university, and in time be a student in my office?" "Yes, mynheer." "You would not grow restless, think you, and change your mind, just as I had set my heart upon preparing you to be my successor?" Hans's eyes flashed. "No, mynheer, I would not change." "You may believe him there," cried the dame, who could remain quiet no longer. "Hans is like a rock when once he decides. And as for study, mynheer, the child has almost grown fast to his books of late. He can jumble off Latin already like any priest." The doctor smiled. "Well, Hans, I see nothing to prevent us from carrying out this plan, if your father agrees." "Ahem," said Ralph, too proud of his boy to be very meek. "The fact is, mynheer, I prefer an active outdoor life myself. But if the boy's inclined to study for a meester, and he'd have the benefit of your good word to push him on in the world, it's all one to me. The money's all that's wanting, but it mightn't be long with two strong pair of arms to earn it before we—" "Tut, tut," interrupted the doctor. "If I take your right-hand man away, I must pay the cost, and glad enough will I be to do it. It will be like having two sons, Lorenz? One a merchant, and the other a surgeon. I shall be the happiest man in Holland. Come to me in the morning, Hans, and we will arrange matters at once." Hans bowed assent. He dared not trust himself to speak. "And Brinker," continued the doctor, "my son Lorenz will need a trusty, ready man like you when he opens his warehouse in Amsterdam. Someone to oversee matters and see that the lazy clowns round about the place do their duty. Someone to— Oh, why don't you tell him yourself, you rascal?" The last was addressed to the son and did not sound half as fierce as it looks in print. The rascal and Ralph soon understood each other perfectly. "I'm loath to leave the dikes," said the latter, after they had talked together a while, "but it's such a good offer, mynheer. I'd be robbing my family if I let it go past me." Take a long look at Hans as he sits there, staring gratefully at the meester, for you shall not see him again for many years. And Gretel, what a vista of puzzling work suddenly opens before her. Yes, for dear Hans's sake she will study now. If he really is to be a meester, his sister must not shame his greatness. How faithfully those glancing eyes shall yet seek for jewels that lie hidden in rocky schoolbooks. and how they shall yet brighten and droop at the coming of one whom she knows of now only as the boy who wore a red cap on that wonderful day when she found the silver skates in her apron. But the doctor and Lorenz are going. Dame Brinker is making her best curtsy. Ralph stands beside her, looking every inch a man as he grasps the meester's hand. Through the open cottage door we can look out upon the level Dutch landscape, all alive with falling snow. Our story is nearly all told. Time passes in Holland just as surely and steadily as here. In that respect, no country is odd. For the Brinker family, it has brought great changes. Hans has spent the years faithfully and profitably, conquering obstacles as they arose, and pursuing one object with all the energy of his nature. If often the way has been rugged, his resolution has never failed. Sometimes he echoes, with his good old friend, the words said long ago in that little cottage near Broek. Surgery is an ugly business, but always, in his heart of hearts, lingers the echo of those truer words. It is great and noble. It awakes a reverence for God's work. Were you in Amsterdam today, you might see the famous Dr. Brinker riding in his grand coach to visit his patients, or it might be you would see him skating with his own boys and girls on the frozen canal. For Annie Bowman, the beautiful, frank-hearted peasant girl, you would inquire in vain, but Annie Brinker, the Frau of the great physician, is very like her. Only, as Hans says, she's even lovelier, wiser, more like a fairy godmother than ever. Peter van Holt also is a married man. I could have told you before that he and Hilda would join hands and glide through life together, just as years ago they skimmed side by side over the frozen, sunlit river. At one time I came near hinting that Katrinka and Karl would join hands. It is fortunate now that the report was not started, for Katrinka changed her mind and is single to this day. The lady is not quite so merry as formerly, and I grieve to say some of the tinkling bells are out of tune. But she is the life of her social circle still. I wish she would be in earnest just for a little while, but no, it is not her nature. Her cares and sorrows do nothing more than disturb the tinkling. They never waken any deeper music. Ricky's soul has been stirred to its depths during these long years. Her history would tell how seed carelessly sown is sometimes reaped in anguish, and how a golden harvest may follow a painful planting. If I mistake not, you may be able to read the written record before long, that is, if you are familiar with the Dutch language. In the witty but earnest author whose words are welcomed at this day in thousands of Holland homes, few would recognize the haughty, flippant Ricky who scoffed at little Gretel. Lambert van Monen and Ludwig van Holt are good Christian men, and what is more easily to be seen at a glance, thriving citizens. Both are dwellers in Amsterdam, but one clings to the old city of that name, and the other one is a pilgrim to the new. Van Monen's present home is not far from Central Park, and he says if the New Yorkers do their duty, the park will in time equal his beautiful Bosch near The Hague. He often thinks of Katrinka of his boyhood, but he is glad now that Katrinka the woman sent him away, though it seemed at the time his darkest hour. Ben's sister Jenny has made him very happy, happier than he could have been with anyone else in the wide world. Karl Schummel has had a hard life. His father met with reverses in business, and as Karl had not many warm friends, and above all was not sustained by noble principles, he has been tossed about by fortune's battledore until his gayest feathers are nearly all knocked off. He's a bookkeeper in the thriving Amsterdam house of Boykman and Schimmelpenninck. Boston Valbart, the junior partner, treats him kindly, and he in turn is very respectful to the monkey with a long name for a tail. Of all our group of Holland friends, Jacob Poot is the only one who has passed away. good-natured, true-hearted, and unselfish to the last. He is mourned now as heartily as he was loved and laughed at while on earth. He grew to be very thin before he died, thinner than Benjamin Dobbs, who is now portliest among the portly. Graf Brinker and his Frau have been living comfortably in Amsterdam for many years, a faithful, happy pair, as simple and straightforward in their good fortune as they were patient and trustful in darker days. They have a summer house near the old cottage, and thither they often repair with their children and grandchildren on the pleasant summer afternoons when the pond lilies rear their queenly heads above the water. The story of Hans Brinker would be but half told if we did not leave him with Gretel standing near. Dear, quick, patient little Gretel. What is she now? Ask old Dr. Boykman. He will declare she is the finest singer, the loveliest woman in Amsterdam. Ask Hans and Annie. They will assure you she is the dearest sister ever known. Ask her husband. He will tell you she is the brightest, sweetest little wife in Holland. Ask Dame Brinker and Raff. Their eyes will glisten with joyous tears. Ask the poor. The air will be filled with blessings. But lest you forget, a tiny form trembling and sobbing on the mound before the Brinker cottage. Ask the Van Glecks. They will never weary telling of a darling little girl who won the silver skates.